It has not escaped my attention that the early 2000s seem to be the in thing right now. And as someone who lived through that, it is extremely weird. But at the same time, I'm noticing something that I didn't notice before when I was younger, because when I was younger, I was doing the same thing. The 80s were like the cool thing to kind of mimic, and even to a certain degree the 60s, because for a little while bell bottoms and peace signs and everything were kind of coming back into fashion when I was in high school. And the thing is, when you're a teenager and you take interest in a past generation's aesthetic, style, anything like that, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that inherently. It's pretty fun. It's a good way to learn about what that generation was going through and to appreciate, where we've come from. But at the same time, the thing that I'm realizing now that I didn't realize back then is that, unfortunately, in adapting a past generation style to fit what you want for yours now, we have this tendency to romanticize those past generations. And although the early 2000s were not that long ago at all, there was actually quite a bit going on back then that was extremely negative, and out of several different generations that have been adapted by mainstream culture for, clothing aesthetic purposes again, I think we need to take a step back and really discuss some of the harmful sides of that entire decade, that first decade of the early 2000s, because maybe the clothing style, makeup style, and hairstyles were kind of funny to you and you find it interesting to try to recreate them for today's youth, but really harmful things were going down. And I want to take a few minutes to discuss some of them because I was there. The first thing I want to bring up is the bimbo culture thing. Bimbo culture is definitely back in the mainstream again, only it's a lot more positive now than it was back then. Nowadays, it's like, oh yeah, I'm a bimbo or a himbo, and that's just a funny word, and it kind of surrounds this culture of people who look a certain way. Sometimes certain people who are on websites like OnlyFans, it's relatively innocent in a way these days, and most of the time people are applying that label to themselves because that is what they want to be called and they're happy with it. Whereas in the early 2000s, you had people like Britney Spears and Paris Hilton specifically being called bimbos, and it was not a positive thing at all. It was a way to shoehorn them into this idiot girl who can barely think for herself or take care of herself mentality. People really looked down on them. They ended up really typecast in a certain role that they didn't want to be in. No one took them seriously if they tried to get out of that role or if they tried to go further in their careers and make themselves into something more than that bimbo stereotype. And it really was nasty. It was very misogynistic. It was very much a rock and hard place situation for people who were considered bimbos in the early 2000s because literally nothing they could do was right. If they wanted to distance themselves from that stereotype, they were basically told that they were never going to be able to cut it. They were never going to be smart enough to do anything else productive with their lives, that this is just what they were, and no one believed in them and no one would give them a chance. But if they remained in that bimbo culture, they kept being thought of as stupid and useless and vapid and a blight on society as a whole. And some people were really, really nasty to them for absolutely no reason. They'd done nothing wrong besides just dress a certain way and act a certain way, and somehow people decided that made them bad people. Another really harmful aspect of the early 2000s was the fact that although the internet had technically existed for a little while by then, the early 2000s and my generation kind of growing up with the internet was the first time you really saw things like MySpace and social media itself explode. We finally didn't have to confine ourselves to just chat rooms. We were able to have this really awesome social media platform where we could customize it to fit our own personal aesthetic and whatever we were feeling at the time, share our thoughts, share our music that we enjoyed, share each other. And it was a really fun place to be. Unfortunately, some of our parents, although possibly a little bit overprotective, were not incorrect in their thinking that MySpace could be a very dangerous place for children to be. Because at the end of the day, no matter how adult we thought we were on MySpace, if we were under 18, we were minors. And because social media was in its infancy at the time, there really wasn't much in place to moderate it and ensure the safety of the people who were utilizing it. So you ended up having people who were really bad people blow up on there. People like Jeffree Star and Dahvie Vanity, who ended up using their platforms for the wrong reasons and continuing to do that to this day because they blew up so much on there. And you also had people who were minors, generally women, get reached out to by men who were way too old to be talking to someone who's a 16-year-old emo on MySpace. And because the guy would seem really nice and seem like he genuinely loved this girl and wanted to take care of her and wanted her to have a happy life and get her away from, her abusive parents or something, grooming kind of started to run rampant on the internet. It was very easy for groomers to get a hold of these minors who just wanted a fresh start, who wanted freedom, who wanted to get away from their parental situation and be able to fall in love and have that fairy tale romance. And unfortunately, again, because you couldn't really moderate things as well back then, it was easy for them to have this happen. And most parents did not understand how to use social media yet. So even if they wanted to keep their children safe, it was very difficult for them to ensure that they were absolutely not on the internet whatsoever. Because trust me, where there's a will, there's a way. Even if they were banned from electronic devices at home, they were using them at school. And the last thing I want to bring up about the early 2000s today that was incredibly harmful and is still carried by a lot of us to this day is that in the early 2000s, there was a huge rise in eating disorders because people were disgustingly fat phobic. If you think it's bad nowadays, you should have seen it back in the early 2000s. To put it in perspective, there were a lot of magazines that were geared toward teenage girls at the time. And it was really fun to read them because you get to see what was in style, make sure that you looked cool when you went to school, make sure that you had, the latest makeup down pat. Not that it looked that great back then, but it was just kind of fun to, have something that was basically a teenage girl's version of Cosmo. However, in mainstream media, whether it be magazines, television, movies, whatever, in the early 2000s, rail thin, and I mean skeletal, is what was in. That was the only way you were going to get respect. It was the only way that people were going to think that you were worth their time and that you were beautiful. I personally, as a teenager, I believe I was 16 or 17 at the time, had someone approach me and they legitimately thought this was a compliment. They legitimately thought this was a positive thing. I was a size 2 at the time. A size 2. And they told me I would make a beautiful plus size model. And I was shocked at the time because I was like, I thought I was pretty skinny, but here's this person saying I needed to be a plus size model. And a lot of my friends went through the same thing. People would tell them they'd make a beautiful plus size model when they were maybe a size 4 or 5. So I looked into it and I was looking at all these magazines that were advertising things like clothing. And sure enough, girls who were a size 6 jeans were being advertised in the plus size section, and that was incredibly harmful. Not only did it perpetuate things like anorexia and bulimia because people would be like, well, I don't want to be considered plus size when I'm a size 2 or 4. I want to be skinny. And they would start calorie counting and becoming gym rats and doing whatever they could to avoid that because the plus size section was the bad section. And it wasn't our fault we thought that way. That's what society told us. If you were fat, you were either going to be the funny, plucky sidekick on TV or in movies, or you just didn't exist at all, or you were ugly and nobody valued you, which is horrible to be telling people of any age, but especially teenagers whose minds are still kind of forming and they're still coming into who they are as people. And it also perpetuated a seriously fat-phobic culture on the other side of the issue, because these plus-size girls were like, well, here I am trying to find clothing that's going to fit me, and in the magazines, these tiny little size 4 to size 8 girls are advertising all my clothing. How am I supposed to know if it's going to look good on me or not when that is not how a plus-size person looks? And this is still an issue today, even though we've come a long way. Things are far from perfect. And even though there are truly plus-size models advertising plus-size clothing, a lot of us who were still minors in the early 2000s and were made to think that we were plus-size by being a size 8 are still struggling with the aftershock of eating disorders to this day. And this video is not to say that you shouldn't enjoy the early 2000s, that you shouldn't consume the content from back then or enjoy the aesthetic. Enjoy whatever you want. It's not hurting anyone, but make sure that if you are enjoying the aesthetics of a generation that came before you, that you are also paying attention to the harmful side of that generation, because unfortunately, part of the aesthetic of that generation was this skinny, tiny, skeletal girl figure. And that's the reason you had things like low-rise jeans and stuff in fashion, because you had no ass. So that's what they thought looked good back then. But anyway, I don't want to get too much further into that and sound like I'm body shaming, because that's not what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to say don't do that. And yeah, this is just kind of a rambly video that just came to my mind today. That's pretty much all I have to say on it. So I will see everyone in the next one.